This video is for reading 54, which is entitled Sexual Harassment and Masculinity, The Power and Meaning of Girl Watching. And the author is Beth Quinn. So for this reading, I am going to immediately jump into the additional sociological background um, to help contextualize the reading itself. And the focus of my additional sociological background is going to be around gendered violence and how it relates to the concept of hegemonic masculinity. So, hegemonic masculinity is a concept that's come up in relation to previous readings, right? And so, keep in mind that hegemonic masculinity is that dominant definition of masculinity that exists in a society, which all men are to a certain extent defined, evaluated, and judged by. And although the exact definition of hegemonic masculinity, can and has varied over time, even in 2021, there are still some kind of key characteristics that we associate with this kind of primary idealization of masculinity. This is a man who is brave and tough, is financially successful, if not necessarily well off, at least the breadwinner in his own home. This is a man who is athletic, who is emotionally stoic. It is that kind of dominant conception of masculinity. And although we're very aware that many men in society, don't have these characteristics, this is still kind of that primary model of masculinity that a lot of people reach to when they are wanting to describe, an American man. And so there is this link between hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity can be thought of as strategic enactments of masculinities that are harmful to both the men who enact them and the people around them. So, because there are elements of hegemonic masculinity, toughness, bravery, being daring and adventurous, not being emotional, when pushed to the extreme, these types of traits can easily become toxic. It encourages men to conflate, bravery and courage and strength with, being potentially aggressive and violent. It encourages, uh, not just being stoic and tough, but being emotionless, lacking empathy, because those characteristics are seen as being girly and effeminate. And so those traits, when displayed in this kind of in this way that is toxic, that is harmful, to the men who enact them and the people around them, what does this look like? Well, if you're thinking about harm to self, it's a necessary risk taking that can result in injury or accidental death. Is self-harm, and particularly we see this with men and young boys in regards to alcoholism and binge drinking, as well as suicide. And you can see it almost every single age. The suicide rate for boys far exceeds the suicide rate for girls. It is, the inclination that men have to not just work dangerous jobs because they're the only ones available, but to almost seek them out and to revel in them as being kind of an indicator of their manliness and their toughness. So sometimes there's even a resistance to like make those jobs safer or to crack down on those jobs policies to make them safer. And then, of course, another way that we see this as a harm to self is they're less likely to practice self care. Men are less likely to wear seatbelts. They're less likely to go to the doctor. They're, less likely to take medication as prescribed. And all of this can kind of be related back to, this false sense that as men they need to be tough, they need to be strong, And when, like I said, when pushed to the kind of extreme expression of that, it can become harmful. But not just harmful to themselves, it's also harmful to others. So we're going to talk a little bit about gendered violence on the next slide, how specific types of violence um, are gendered in the sense that one gender is more likely to enact them against another gender, and we can see patterns in those violent activities. But then beyond gender violence, men are also just more likely to join gangs, enact suicide bombings, be serial killers and mass murderers, join violent hate groups. And I gave you a little infographic from a documentary that I would occasionally show in class called Tough Guys Too, that really just speaks to the fact that a lot of violence in society is committed by men. Additionally, if you want some extra reading, because who doesn't love extra reading, I have two articles related to the relationship between gender and mass shootings, and gender and uh, taking part and joining in extremist, hate groups. But focusing now a little bit more on this idea of gendered violence. So, like I said, gendered violence is oftentimes violent acts where the gender of either the perpetrator or the victims seems to be key in helping us understand why this violence is being committed and why it's taking place. And it's just worth noting that um, men are more likely to be the perpetrators of violence, but they're also more likely to be the victims. And that's because male on male violence, man on man violence is one of the most is the most common form of violence. And uh, to the extent that if you just think about it, you know, there's a possibility that you have, two different men or more kind of engaging in this toxic masculinity, engaging in this gender strategy where they push hegemonic masculinity to the extreme. And you can see how this maybe leads to violence in the form of fighting and assaults, and potentially even murder. Male on female violence, of course, is maybe the type of gendered violence that came to mind. And it is worth noting that although women are less likely than men to be victims, given the rarity of female on female violence, it is worth noting that women are certainly at greater risk in their intimate personal relationships of experiencing violence from men that they know, as well as experiencing violence against men that they don't know. And like I said, one key aspect of gendered violence is that we often point to gender as being key to understanding the motivation behind that violence. And so when you're talking about male on female violence, a concept that frequently comes up is aggrieved or thwarted entitlement. And that, when that entitlement is expressed and leads to murder, we sometimes refer to this as misogynistic murder. And it's this idea, because of sexism, the idea that men are superior to women and have a superior standing in society to women. When men feel like their entitlement to women, their entitlement to their attention, their entitlement to their bodies, their entitlement to their love, when they feel like it has been thwarted or aggrieved, meaning women are not behaving as they expect that they should behave. They are not behaving as objects, but instead are asserting their own independence and desires and wills. This can lead to uh, violent reaction. And the final type of gendered violence, female on male violence. Part of why I include that little graph up at the top is because you can see that if we're talking specifically about homicides of intimates by gender of victim, you can see that the number of men who have been killed by their intimates, and in a society where overwhelming number of the population are heterosexual, this means, men who were probably largely killed by their female intimate partners. You can see that it dramatically declined from the 1970s and 1980s to the early aughts. And that's because, especially as divorce laws became less strict, as domestic violence shelters geared towards women and other resources like that became more readily available, um, a lot of those male victims of female violence in the 70s and 80s, a lot of them were women who were trapped in intimate partner abuse situations, who ultimately wound up killing their partner because they felt it was their only way out of an abusive situation. So as we started to provide women in more particular, um, like I said, better access to resources to leave those relationships, as we started to make divorce less stigmatized and more accessible, you can see that the number of women killing their male partners did decline. And a lot of it, like I said, is related to the fact that when given other options to get out of those relationships, women would do so. And they did not necessarily think that the only recourse they had was killing their male partner. But as you can see, although the number of women killed by their male partners did decline, it wasn't nearly as dramatic. And now the gap between women killed by their partners versus men killed by their partners, that gap in the last 40, 50 years has dramatically increased. And you can see, just kind of comparing it, that the percent of total female and total male homicide victims, um, for women, it's over one third of women killed in the years 2003 to 2012. They were killed by their intimate partners, by people who supposedly loved them or used to love them. And you can see that for men, this is only a small percentage of male homicide victims. Men are just much less likely to be killed by their intimate partners. So, why do I open with that? I open with that because oftentimes people will treat sexual harassment as if it's not that serious, and they wonder why women are making such a big deal about it. They treat it like it's joking. Um, but I wanted you to understand the kind of larger social context that this sexual harassment exists in, right? Because for all the men out there who engage in that behavior in a joking fashion, for women, it is the very real possibility that, if you confront a man, if you ignore someone that is harassing you, that this will be the person who perhaps is coming at this less from a game type of perspective, and more from this thwarted entitlement perspective. So, one way for you to kind of contextualize and consider why women find this behavior, why they take it more seriously, why they find it more problematic than men, one way that you can kind of understand that is just by putting yourself in the shoes of women in today's society, and the very real threat that they face from men, just because of, like I said, these gendered violence patterns. And so the author, Quinn, does open with this discussion of how men and women see the issue of sexual harassment very differently. And she notes that men say that women are too sensitive, or they're misinterpreting men's intentions. But a lot of women note that men just don't get it, and that um, the policies that we have surrounding sexual harassment, particularly in the workplace, have largely been inadequate, particularly at the time that Quinn was writing and collecting her data, which was in the 90s. So Right from the start of the article, she explains her intent. She wants to focus on girl watching within workplaces to understand how perpetrators kind of subjectively view and explain their actions, as well as to a lesser extent, how the victims or targets of such actions view them. And so the methodology involved is in depth interviews with 43 employed men and women. And this took place during 1994, 1995, and her sample was recruited either through a specific company, which, obviously this is a pseudonym, Acme Electronics, or they were students in a evening community college course or summer university course. For the respondents who were recruited through Acme Electronics, Quinn also engages in what we call a participant observation methodology, um, where she basically observed, she observed their actions at Acme Electronics for, she said, a month. um, she chose to center her analysis on this phenomena because, first of all, she said, the prevalence of it, that you know um, a lot of women who had been surveyed said that they had experienced unwanted sexual looks and gestures, or sexual teasing jokes, remarks, or questions. And the second reason why she focuses on girl watching is she says, comparative to other forms of harassment and certainly other forms of gender violence, this particular form is oftentimes normalized and trivialized as just, this is just boys being boys, or this is just locker room behavior. And, before she gets into her study, she does note that girl watching can take on various forms and have various functions depending on the context and who is involved. But as she explains on page 559, the type that she is specifically interested in is what she characterizes as play. Um, you know, this is maybe girl watching that is meant to be more of a male bonding activity, a game that the male employees bond over and participate in, as opposed to, maybe the street harassment that's maybe meant to be more threatening, or is meant to exist primarily to disempower or to make women feel uncomfortable. That is not the type of girl watching that she is specifically interested in. And that's because she says, she really does want to focus on how men use girl watching as a game to build a shared masculine identity, and to engage in social relations kind of built around this masculine identity. So before she gets into her specific research, she kind of, quickly notes some of the things that other research has revealed, that the extent to which behavior is or is not labeled sexual harassment, does differ by gender. Women are more willing to define more acts as sexual harassment, and they're more likely to see situations as coercive. Men have much more narrower conceptions of sexual harassment and are less willing to define uh, a broader range, a more diverse range of scenarios as being sexual harassment. In regards to who is to blame for these types of situations, men are more likely to blame and less likely to empathize with the victim. And Men are more likely to dismiss such behavior, um, and if when women say that they have been sexually harassed in an office place, particularly by a supervisor, men are more apt to kind of, suggest that, to a certain extent, that, women either brought such behavior upon themselves, or on some levels, appreciated it, welcomed it. And she goes over some of the theoretical explanations for those gender differences on page 560. But ultimately, she kind of includes that, um, that she thinks that, a better theoretical explanations are just still needed, and that even, theories that have been promising, have been limited, because they don't effectively explain, the motivations, for some of the more indirect forms of sexual harassment, and it that these earlier theoretical explanations also don't adequately address, you know, the motivations that men have to engage in some of this more subjective sexual harassment behavior. Um, and so that is kind of what her study is meant to address. So, before we get into our study, let's just quickly discuss what's meant by sexual harassment, particularly sexual harassment in the workplace. So, sexual harassment in the workplace in particular, has largely been defined as falling into kind of like three categories. There's the quid pro quo, which is if an employer, a supervisor, a manager, makes it seem like in order for you to receive some type of benefit or promotion, related to your job, you need to do something often sexual for them. The best example of that is, of course, the stories that have come out now about like the casting couch in Hollywood, the idea that you had to meet with, sleep with, engage in some type of sexual intimacy with like the male producer or director, in order to be in the movie, right? So quid pro quo means something for something. And it has been clearly stated as being, illegal, um, you know, uh, since the 70s. But obviously, people have engaged in that behavior, despite it being illegal. Then there's the hostile work environment. This is the more nuanced form of sexual harassment. A lot of the more recent cases have focused more on hostile work environment because it can be a little bit more subjective about what that means. But basically, it means that you have, created a work environment that is not conducive to a person being able to comfortably, adequately do their job. And the source of their discomfort is in some way related to, their gender or sexual identity. And then there's maybe the type of sexual harassment that maybe most of us think of. And this is, verbal, nonverbal, or physical harassment, on the basis of a person's sex or gender identity. And so this is the type of, um, this is the type of behavior that Quinn is referring to. But it's also worth noting that, being in the position where a lot of your fellow male employees are overtly, engaging in this girl watching behavior also could be grounds for a hostile work environment sexual harassment charge as well. So two of the three seem like they would be relevant here in Quinn's study. So, based on those interviews that she did, what were some of Quinn's findings? Basically, when she was just asking people like really broad questions about their kind of everyday experiences, about their work life and their work setting, no man discusses girl watching in that initial discussion. It only emerges when forced to consider themselves as gendered workers through hypothetical questions. So they don't really think about the ways in which, their girl watching is an integral part of their work lives or work experiences until she explicitly asked them, how would their experience at work change if all of a sudden they found themselves women in this same office. And then it becomes more apparent, the extent to which this type of behavior occurs once they are kind of forced to put themselves in the shoes of their female counterparts. And so in these interviews, once she starts talking with them about this girl watching behavior, she notes that it appears to function as a form of gendered play among men. She describes it as a targeted tactic of power because when they engage in this gaze, it reduces the women in their office to objects. although she notes the disempowerment of women is not the primary goal or function. So they are reducing the women in their office to objects, they're objectifying them. And women are not, seen as actors in this game so much as they are seen as objects. Um, but the focus seems to be more on, it being a game played for men by men. It's, it's a type of activity where a specific type of masculinity is produced, right? This kind of dominant, hegemonic, like I'm powerful, and as well as heterosexual desire. Let me talk sexually about my female coworkers as a way of showing, I'm a manly man, a manly heterosexual man like you. And so, there are several important kind of, points that kind of can be made here. Um, the fact that despite working with these women as colleagues, the fact that when they're engaging in this girl watching behavior, they reduce them to objects and don't even really think about the ways in which this disempowers their female colleagues and might make them feel uncomfortable, just illustrates that, the lack of empathy that they have for their female colleagues until she kind of explicitly makes them consider it, by having them engage in that gender reversal scenario. And when they engage in the gender reversal scenario and they're forced to see women as subjects as opposed to objects, this allows them to maybe consider it from the standpoint of the women in the office, where it's no longer seen as being fun and games, and instead, makes it clear like how this can be uncomfortable situation to find yourself in. And the fact that she kind of had to push them, to engage in this type of empathy. Once again, it kind of relates to the cultural constructions that we have around masculinity, because that hegemonic masculine ideal isn't that men should be empathetic, that men should be sensitive, that men should be introspective and caring. That isn't the messages that we tend to give men about who the ideal man is, as opposed to, that does relate to a lot of the behavioral and personality expectations we have around women, that women are supposed to be caring, women are supposed to be sensitive, women are supposed to, be kind and care about the feelings of others. um, it explains why for a lot of these men, particularly, once again, like I said, this is in the 90s. So maybe this would be different if she repeated this study today, but especially in the 90s for these adult men, it explains why they had to be prompted to kind of consider the feelings of their female colleagues. And that finding that men understand women as objects as opposed to players in the game relates to, what happens, when they get caught by the women, engaging in this girl watching play. Um, because just because they see women as objects doesn't mean that women don't really exist, as subjects in their real lives, in their workplace settings. And so when women would notice and sometimes call them out on their girl watching activity, oftentimes she says the men would be kind of confused and taken aback because, in that moment, by only seeing them as objects, the fact is that objects do not object. That's from page 566. So the fact that women are asserting their their existence as subjects and not just objects, really can kind of throw the game in a disarray. They don't want to actively be confronted by the targets of their girl watching. They want them to just exist on this kind of object level. But clearly, especially when in a workplace setting, that's not necessarily going to be the outcome. And so, as this happens, of course, and some women are actively reporting these incidents to HR, and HR is having to roll out these anti-sexual harassment training programs. the author kind of ends this reading by making some suggestions about the effectiveness of these anti-sexual harassment training programs and what the implications of her research for these training programs are. She was like, it's unsurprising that a lot of these programs haven't been successful, because they haven't addressed the fact that because this type of harassment is subjectively seen differently by men and women, and for men is oftentimes being used as this male bonding exercise and as a way of defining their masculinity. When they are taking these programs, particularly if they take them as a group, what happens is the gender divide basically becomes reinforced. And she says, the idea that the way you target sexual harassment is by providing more information also doesn't seem to really hold up, because this doesn't seem to be motivated by ignorance, so much as it's kind of being motivated, by this desire, for engaging in social relations within your gender group. At least that's the motivation for the men involved in this. So she suggests, that if the key to not engaging in this behavior is putting yourself in the shoes of the women being targeted, because that is what seems to trigger some type of empathetic response, then that is what more successful anti-sexual harassment training programs need to find a way to do. They need to find a way to encourage the empathy response in men, so that instead of focusing on their own kind of existence in this game as, subjects, as the individuals who have the power to kind of enact this gaze, instead finding a way to get them to empathize with the targets of that gaze, and understanding it from their vantage point, is key, if you want a more successful anti-sexual harassment training program.